My name is Rob Dunbar, and I'd like to warmly welcome everybody to this afternoon's event. It's an event that's been organized as part of the Universities and Cities Gaelic Week, which starts today. There are a large number of events going on over the next week or thereabouts. And we're very happy to get the festival rolling with this event. And it's an event sponsored by Bilingualism Matters Edinburgh branch, the original branch founded by one of our speakers today, indeed our first speaker, Professor Antonella Sorace. The center is now international in scope. And perhaps Antonella, as part of her presentation, will say a couple of words about Bilingualism Matters, but part of the remit of Bilingualism Matters is to provide to as wide an audience as possible information on all aspects of bilingualism, and certainly the research that members of Bilingualism Matters does is of obvious relevance to Gaelic. Fesca de Jupichin Brin Asavirla as the Tachbanian, Ach Ekenjerig Maha Keshchaku Ounce Gaelic, Viemich Overtochen Politia Question Ounce Gaelic, Einwurf, Agus Ulalanji Beige Gaelic. Our presentations this afternoon will be primarily in English. But at the end, we'll have a question and answer session, and we're very happy for you to ask questions in either Gaelic or English. And the plan for the next hour and a half is that there will be 3 presentations from members of Bilingualism Matters. The first presentation will be by Professor Antonella Sorace entitled New Speakers and Old Friends. That will be followed by a presentation by our colleague Vicky Fondogliani, who's going to speak about a project that she's been involved in. And the title of her presentation is Becoming Bilingual Through Gaelic Immersion Education. And finally, my colleague, Professor Wilson MacLeod, and I will be doing a presentation on some new developments in terms of Gaelic policy, focusing particularly on a couple of the important commitments in the Scottish National Party manifesto. So that's our plan of attack. So I would like to begin by welcoming our colleague and our friend, Professor Antonella Sorace. Professor Sorace is the Professor of Developmental Linguistics at the University of Edinburgh, and she's a Fellow of the British Academy at the University in 2008, and now heads a network, an international network, as I mentioned, of 30 branches around the world. And she is the director of the new social enterprise, Bilingualism Matters Limited, which was established in 2021. And as I said, her topic this afternoon is new speakers, old speakers, language change in Gaelic and other minority languages. So, volume 40 chrial chud edma hopliche and holu and harslalu Antonella Sorace. Antonella, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Rob. I hope you can hear me and see my slides. Yes? Good. I wish I could give this presentation in Gaelic. I can't, unfortunately. But I'm definitely very pleased to be here. I would like to start with, assuming that I can scroll my, scrolling my slides has been, yes. I would like to start with this rather sobering graph that I've used before, because it gives an idea of the situation with minority languages around the world. The situation, as summarized by this graph, says that of the nearly approximately 7,000 existing languages in the world, and nobody knows how many, 25 languages account for more than half of the world's population. And that means that the vast majority of languages are indeed minority languages, wherever they are, in every country in which they're spoken, and they are minority languages in a situation of coexistence with one or more majority languages. So this is a very sobering situation, because maintaining linguistic diversity is definitely should be one of our priorities, because maintaining linguistic diversity is obviously related to maintaining cultural diversity. So what can we do? I mean, Gaelic is not one of the most endangered minority language. So there are minority languages that basically have only a handful of speakers left. Gaelic is not in this position, and we want to make sure that Gaelic actually continues to not only to survive, but possibly to thrive over generations. So what can we do about that? One thing we can do is, for example, from the point of view of research on language and cognition, we can point out, as research does, that bilingualism in any languages can have a series of positive effects on both children and adults. And I'm not going to go into the details of these effects, because this is not the main focus of my talk. Just to list some of them, a better understanding of how language works implicitly in bilingual children, which may give a head start in early literacy. Outside the language domain, a better awareness that other people can have different perspectives and different points of view. A better ability to pay focused attention on the task that one is doing, and the ability to not only handle conflicting information, but also adapt to change. So flexibility not only in switching from one task to the other, but also in adapting to changing circumstances. So these are all very general benefits that come from having more than one language in the brain. So from this point of view, all languages are good. There are no more useful or less useful languages, because one of the arguments that unfortunately is very common is that there are prestigious languages, useful languages, languages that are useful from an economic point of view, from the point of view of traveling, from the point of view of being a lingua franca in general communication, and less useful languages that, for example, are only spoken in certain environments, like the vast majority of minority languages and all indigenous minority languages. But from this point of view, there is no difference between a prestigious and a non-prestigious language. So this is definitely an argument that we can and we have been proposing, trying to persuade people that all languages are worth maintaining. And if there is an indigenous minority language at the doorstep, governments and people should invest in this language and regard it as a major resource. Now, these effects, these beneficial effects, are not automatic, and this is the other aspect of research. They're not found in all bilinguals, because being bilingual is not a black or white dimension. It's a continuous dimension that can be affected by a variety of factors, many of which we don't fully understand in research. We need more research to understand not only the importance importance of each of these factors in determining where on the bilingual continuum a person is, but also how these factors interact with one another. For example, language distance, typological language distance, speaking two similar languages as opposed to two distant languages. Patterns of use. Do we live in a bilingual community where both languages are spoken by everybody or not? Do we live in a diglossic community where one language is spoken in certain context and the other language in other contexts? But also attitudes, exposure to variation, and so on. It's interesting that when one looks at minority languages, these effects that I mentioned before are not always found. So just this is not an exhaustive list. They're found for Sardinian Italian, for example. They're found for Gaelic and English, and I'll come back to this. They are not found completely for Frisian and Dutch. They are not found for Welsh and English. They are found in Cypriot Greek bilinguals. They are found in Catalan Spanish bilinguals, and they are not found in Basque Spanish bilinguals. There's the last bit of the slide. So these effects are not present in all minority languages. Why not? And I think what children need to grow up bilingual in any language is a variety of things. For example, they need to hear enough of both languages, so enough engaging exposure to both languages, so not just hearing them passively, it's, in a non-engaging way, but really being motivated to speak and hear these languages. Variety of speakers, hearing the language spoken in different ways. So what we call normal variation, which is normal in large communities, in majority languages, but not always in minority languages. And so this natural variation is often not there. The role of literacy is important. I'll come back to this. So Gaelic has an advantage, for example, in terms of Gaelic medium education that is not available in many other minority languages, but also positive attitudes and confidence. And in my own research, I've done research particularly on two minority languages. One is Gaelic. I'll come back to this because I live in Scotland. The other one is Sardinian because I come from a Sardinian background. My mother was from Sardinia, and she decided not to speak Sardinian to me, although she spoke it to relatives. So I had passive exposure to Sardinian, which means that I can understand it, but I don't speak it. Now, we did projects funded by the Sardinian region, where we compared Italian monolingual children and Sardinian Italian bilingual children with respect to language skills in Italian and cognitive effects, some of the cognitive effects that I mentioned before. And what we found, not surprisingly perhaps, was that we don't find differences across the board. In some cases, we don't find any difference. When we find a difference, the difference tends to be in favor of the bilingual children. And this is a generalization that we can make. When there is a difference, there isn't always a difference, but when there is one, it tends to be in favor of bilinguals. In Sardinia, there is no Sardinian medium education. Sardinian tends to be the home language. Italian is spoken outside the home. There are big fights, political fights about the status of written Sardinian, which is not agreed yet, and that is a big limitation. We did similar studies on Scottish Gaelic and Gaelic. So we compared English monolingual Scottish children and English Gaelic bilingual children. Again, we found that no differences across the board, but when there is a difference, it's in favor of the bilingual children. In the case of Gaelic, there is, and I'm coming back to this, there is the interesting interesting issue of new speakers of Gaelic. So young people, children and young people who don't come from a Gaelic speaking family, but go to Gaelic medium education and they learn Gaelic at school, even if they don't speak it at home. So big difference with the Sardinian environment. And first of all, I would like to point out that attitudes are very important, because particularly in not only in heritage speakers of Gaelic, so children who come from Gaelic speaking families, but also new speakers of Gaelic in very important ways. So we did this research where we actually talked to children, to bilingual children, older children from Gaelic English bilingual children, as well as children from migrant families. And we found, when talking to these children in depth, we found that their attitudes really varied quite a lot. And positive attitudes tended to correlate with higher results in cognitive tests, but also higher fluency in the minority language. So positive attitudes in encouraging school environments, in positive family environments, are more likely to show, for example, the cognitive benefits of bilingualism. Again, perhaps not terribly surprising, but important to pin down as a result of research, because this is something that we can actually show with data. Now, the study, we did another study on new speakers of Gaelic, where we discovered, we were interested in attitudes again, and we discovered that young people who learned Gaelic at school, obviously they don't have any negative attitudes towards Gaelic, but it turned out that Gaelic is not really part of their lives in the same way as English. English is considered to be more attractive, cool, part of these young people's lives. Gaelic is not really. Gaelic is seen as more cultured, but not really part of their lives. Now, if the idea behind, encouraging new speakers of minority languages, part of the idea is to make sure that when their time comes, these new speakers will decide to speak the minority language to their children. So intergenerational transmission of minority languages, which is essential for their survival. So no policy can actually help a language that is not transmitted to the next generation. So the question is whether these new speakers will indeed contribute to intergenerational transmission of Gaelic. But the main point that I wanted to make with respect to attitudes is also the question of language change. And this is very important. This is what we've noticed in other minority language environments. So the fact, and this is a fact, that living languages in contact with one another change in both directions. So they change both in the same bilingual individual brain and in the same bilingual community. So this is an absolutely normal process that is selective. So it's not random. And we can predict, which aspects of the language are going to be affected first, for example. So it's predictable to some extent, but it has to be taken into account in a way that it often isn't. And we think, because we've been working on this, that in fact, in bilingual speakers, there is a kind of ecology of changes in the native language, in the first language, and learning another language. So basically, these are two sides of the same coin. And we have good reason to think, although we need more research, that actually what goes under the bad name of attrition, so which suggests language loss and erosion and so on, but we regard as natural change, in the first language is functional to good proficiency in another language and balanced bilingualism in both languages. So two sides of the same coin in this respect. And when we look at what happens in bilinguals, yes, there are bidirectional changes from aspects, structural aspects of the first language to the second language, but also the other way around. So the second language to the first language, but also effects of having more than one language in the brain and having to adjust, for example, from a processing point of view, from the choice of vocabulary and structures to particular contextual situations. So, these are this is the area where we find, many of the changes due to bilingualism. So not so much, big structural changes, but changes in the way the grammar is accessed, the vocabulary is accessed in particular context. And these changes are partly reversible because they depend on the situation, what the speaker is talking about, who they are talking to, and so on and so forth. So bidirectional changes are functional. And when we look at these changes that happen in bilingualism, we see that actually, again, they're not random. They lead to some extent to a balance between a simplification of the language and the degree of informativeness of the language, which are in a potential trade-off relationship. So the simpler the language, the less informative. The more informative, the more complex. So there is a trade-off, but it seems that the way bilinguals, this ecology of L1 and L2 in bilinguals leads to an ideal balance. So more communication efficiency that doesn't sacrifice really either complexity or informativeness. And all of this also in the view of the perception of the other person's perspective. So adjustments that take into account the other person's perspective. So again, these are not random changes, they're changes that don't lead to deterioration in the language. Unfortunately, and this is the point that I'm making, many of these language changes in situations of language contact are seen as forms of contamination, deterioration, loss of standards, and so on. And this is damaging for the prospects of minority languages. So the roots of language changes in minority languages, but also in any language that has a smaller language community. So in a smaller language community, there is reduced exposure to language variation, as I said before, which is essential for the maintenance of the language. So the smaller the community, the less linguistic variation there is. But also speakers in smaller communities tend to align with each other. They tend to prime each other in interaction. And so many of the changes that are in progress tend also to be transmitted synchronically in interaction among speakers. So this is, same generation speakers. Then the next generation, so one generation's ahead, if children hear enough input in the language, they tend to regularize this variation in the input they get from parents, and then the grammar changes over time. So second generation, third generation speakers of that language, they don't speak the same language essentially as their parents and their grandparents. And that's why it's important not to expect young people who speak minority languages to speak like their grandparents. Unfortunately, this is what happens in many minority language contexts. And it's not a widespread view, but it's strong enough that it gains visibility. I was at a conference in Wales last year where this point was made about Welsh and about so-called purists, purism in Welsh speakers, and how much young people were put off by this kind of puristic attitude. So the expectation that if these speakers just borrow a word from English, or if they mix English and Welsh, well, they're not speaking properly. Wenglish is this kind of, hybrid language that is frowned upon by puristic, attitudes, and this tends to be put people off. That if I had time, I would show you that video by a young Gaelic speaker who actually says, I want to speak Gaelic. I enjoy Gaelic, Welsh. I enjoy speaking Welsh, but not if I get corrected all the time, not if they expect me to speak like my grandparents. So embracing language change is very important. And I want to refer to this very nice paper by Wilson and Bernadette O'Rourke about new speakers of Gaelic, where this perception, they discuss the perception of authenticity and appropriateness in a very pointy way. And so this is a quote, there is a degree of tension between the new speakers and so on. I can't even read the quote because it's covered. What they see as more authentic and real, but at the same time, they recognize that they have a new speaker identity that allows them to use the language differently and so on and so forth. But that tension is there in some minority languages more than others. But it seems to me that we really have to embrace the fact that languages change over time. And if we want to keep them alive and lively, as part of young people's lives, we have to accept that, these languages are changing. They are influenced by the majority language. The majority language is also influenced by the minority language. As I said before, it goes in both directions. But very often this perception is distorted by expectations of, the language is going down the drain, it's getting contaminated, and so on. And we know that Gaelic is declining. These are very telling graphs that show how, and this is not just Gaelic, all minority languages are declining at a great rate. There is one language that dies every 2 weeks. And Gaelic is not there, fortunately, it's not there, not at that stage. But between 1891 and 2011, you see the decline of the language over time, given by the green areas and how much they narrow down over time, and they're much more restricted. So to conclude, we want to encourage, obviously, language revitalization of Gaelic as well as all other minority languages, because preserving linguistic diversity is absolutely vital for the world, because it means preserving cultural diversity, and that can only be good for humanity. But sometimes we see that language policies, intervention, they need to be more connected with communities of speakers. So they have to take into account, various aspects of relating not only to, existing speakers, but also new speakers of the language. That is a very good idea to encourage. And this connection is essential if we want to ensure the intergenerational transmission of Gaelic as well as the other minority languages. And that's why we, as Bilingualism Matters, try to provide accessible, accurate information to various members of society, parents, learners, teachers, policymakers, not only about the benefits of bilingualism, but also about the challenges of bilingualism, that if they are understood, then they can be addressed. The developmental facts of bilingualism, because knowledge about these facts leads to better decisions, more informed decisions. And Also, we need to make the language real for children and young people. I mentioned these results of our study with new speakers of Gaelic that don't really feel that the language is part of their lives, because we want them to, if it's part of their lives, then yes, it will be natural for them to speak it to their children when the time comes. And we have to boost confidence in both in heritage speakers of minority languages and in new speakers of minority languages through information. That's why we are here. Yes, as Rob said, we have a wide international network with many countries where they deal with indigenous minority languages as well as minority languages introduced by migration. And so we can bring together not only different research kinds of expertise, research expertise, but also different experiences of public engagement, different experiences of building bridges between research and society. And we can pull them together and get the best out of our collaboration. Yes, we are now a non-profit organization that will allow us to deal with the international network, hopefully in a more efficient way, really bringing together our expertise, our experiences, and our research backgrounds to everybody's advantage. These are the ways to get in touch with us, and thank you very much for listening.
Tapalat mór washat anaborochain indroch Antonella agus mihin agus kach fatan a comment son thank you very much, Antonella, for a very rich and stimulating and indeed challenging presentation for us this afternoon. And there will be, as I said, opportunities to ask questions at the end of the three presentations. I would like now to, first of all, I mentioned that this event is really the first of many events over the next week as part of the Gaelic Festival here in Edinburgh. And in the chat box, I've just sent out a link to the website for the Edinburgh Gaelic Festival, and I'd encourage those in attendance to take a look at the events. This afternoon's event, as I said, is the first. There are two other events tonight, including the Bohan, the Gaelic nightclub here in Edinburgh that's taking place, but a number of online events as well. So I encourage you to take a look at all of that. So let me now introduce once again our second speaker, Dr. Vicky Chandra-Gyani. Is a colleague, an esteemed and valued colleague of ours here at the University of Edinburgh, where she's senior lecturer in bilingualism. And she's also the Bilingualism Matters Edinburgh Program Director for Bilingual Development and the Development of Language Disorders. And her talk today is entitled Becoming Bilingual Through Gaelic Medium Immersion Education. What are the factors that influence the learning of Gaelic and English in children attending primary Gaelic immersion education in Scotland? And she will take a look at this based on research that's been done with children in P2 to P5. So I'd like to turn things over to Vicky Falcha or Vicky agus you can start whenever you'd like, but a very warm welcome to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rob. You can all see my screen, I think. And thank you, Antonella, for a very stimulating talk. So yes, I've changed my title a bit because I managed to sneak in multilingual in there because these are recent data we just finished analyzing from multilingual, from a small sample of multilingual kids as well, in Gaelic medium education. I'll come to that in a second. And I'm also focusing on vocabulary development, because I know it's a Friday afternoon, late. I don't want to throw too much at you. Hopefully you'll be fine. Okay, so I just want to talk about minority immersion education more generally first, and then in relation to Gaelic. And in general education, when we're thinking about education in another language, there are two kind of major kind of ideas. The first one is looking at children who speak a minority language or a heritage language in the home. So they may speak, for example, Greek or Polish or Italian in the home, and then they live in the UK. So the only option for these children is to go to mainstream English education. That's the kind of mainstream education offered in the UK. So they learn English in an L2 context, so in a second language context, in the context of school. And there's also the other scenario that we see nowadays, primarily in Gaelic medium immersion education, which is basically children from majority language homes. So these are children who speak primarily English in the home, but then their parents decide to, or guardians decide to send them to a minority language education, so Gaelic medium education. And for these children, going to these schools is an educational choice. It's not kind of the only option, as in the case of mainstream education. So Gaelic belongs to kind of the second bullet point that you see here. Although, as we will see in today's talk, it's not always the case that children come from English-speaking homes. Gaelic medium education is also quite popular with children whose parents speak other languages, so languages other than English. It could be multilingual children, and this is the other group that I'll be talking about today. And the other kind of special trait of Gaelic medium education is that it aims at revitalizing Gaelic through instruction. So as Antonella just showed, Gaelic has been in decline for many years. There have been quite a few attempts to try to revitalizing it by introducing it to new speakers as well of the language, but also to younger generations. And one way of doing that is to try to teach it through education. Okay, so here you see a map of Scotland, and the bits in green are the areas that offer Gaelic medium education. Then the different dots represent the different types of Gaelic medium education. I won't go into that in detail. I just wanted to kind of give you a bit of background about Gaelic medium education, because some of you may not be familiar with it. So it was established in Scotland in 1985. Currently, there are approximately 7,000 students in Gaelic medium education. As I said at the beginning, there are two major profiles of students attending GME. So these are either students from English-speaking homes where Gaelic may or may not be spoken, and also and they become bilingual through immersion education, and also students from bilingual homes. So these are children, as I said, whose parents speak languages other than English or Gaelic in the home. And then they go to a Gaelic medium school. So for example, in our sample, we had children whose parents spoke German, Spanish, Mandarin, Polish, Japanese in the home on top of English, and children would go to Gaelic medium schools. And the structure of Gaelic medium education, especially primary education that we're looking at in these two studies. So the focus in the first 3 years is on Gaelic. So everything is taught through the medium of Gaelic. And then English is gradually introduced into the curriculum from P3 onwards, or P4, depending on the school. So in 2018, I got funding from Borna Gaelic to carry out a project looking at the language development of children attending Gaelic medium education. And then we kind of renewed that funding in 2020 and 2021. So we have actually data pre-COVID and during COVID. And the kind of very broad goals of these two projects were the following. So first, we wanted to gauge how language abilities develop across different primary school years in children in in Gaelic medium primary education. So this is GMPE. And in the first phase, as I will show you in a second, we focused on P2 and P3. And in the second phase, we focused on P2 to P5. And the second aim was to examine what linguistic and exposure factors determined children's language skills in English and in Gaelic. So we tested children in both languages. So in phase 1, so we collected data in 2018, that was pre-COVID. We contacted Gaelic medium primary schools in 3 locations in Scotland. So that was in Edinburgh, in Glasgow, and the Isle of Skye. That testing, luckily back then, we were able to carry it out in person. And it was either in children's schools or in the university lab here in Edinburgh. As I said, we had children from P2, which corresponds to approximately 6-year-old children, and also children from P3, so that would be 7-year-old children. And we managed to get 52 children to participate in our study. These were all typically developing children. We also had a smaller group of children that had language disorders, but I'm not talking about these children today. And these children came either from English-speaking homes, so both parents were speaking English, or they were speaking a bit of Gaelic as well. The second phase was, we just actually managed to finish gathering, also collect and analyzing some of the data from that phase. So that was from 2020, 2021. Again, it was Gaelic medium primary schools, but of course there were quite a few differences. The first one was that this project was affected by COVID. So we were not able to actually go into schools and test children or invite them to the lab or go to their homes. All this stuff was not allowed during COVID. So everything had to be done online, and it was done via Zoom. That of course kind of allowed us to test more children. I mean, not more children, but actually children across different locations in Scotland. So we tested children from Aberdeen, Stirling, Western Isles, and again, Glasgow, Edinburgh. So kind of was an overlap in the 2 locations. We tested children from, again, English-speaking homes or Gaelic and English-speaking homes. So these were children between P2 and P5. So from the age of 6 years, again, to the age of 9 years. And we also managed to get a small sample of what we call multilingual children. So these were children whose parents were speaking languages other than English in the home, as I said, German, Japanese, Mandarin, and so on. We looked at vocabulary specifically. So as I said, we looked at various areas, but today I'll be talking about vocabulary, because this is a very good predictor. So how many words a child is able to produce or understand is a very good predictor of their academic ability. So for example, also being able to read and understand academic texts. It also correlates very well with other language abilities, for example, grammar. It correlates very well with the child's cognitive skills, and it also correlates well with socioeconomic status. So although we're looking at one language area, we're able kind of to deduce other things about language cognition and the child's socioeconomic background. And we used 2 tasks, one in English and one in Gaelic. So one was developed during a European cost action by Hammond and colleagues, and the other one was developed during these Borna Gaelic projects by myself and my colleagues. And there was a comprehension one and a production one. So they would either see, let's say, a 4-picture panel, like what you have on the left, and they would be asked, show me boiling. So everything would be in Gaelic, for example, or everything would be in English. And then they would have to point to the picture that corresponds to boiling. So that's the picture at the bottom left corner. Or in production, they would see a picture of a person or an object, and they were asked, what is this person doing? And they would have to say something like laughing in this particular case. And the items in these tasks were targeting nouns and verbs, because we know that there is a different kind of developmental path between nouns and verbs, and we wanted to see whether we also find this, we're going to find this in this particular case. So I'll move on to the results. Okay, so first we're going to look at comprehension and production accuracy. So how accurate they were at producing or comprehending nouns and verbs. And first we're going to look at Gaelic, and then we're going to look at English. So what you see on the x-axis, so down here, is basically the different school years. So P2, P3, P4, and P5. And then there is a color coding I will explain in a second. And then on the y-axis is the accuracy. So whether like 70% accuracy or 100% accuracy and so on. Now, in blue, as you remember, are the results from the first phase. And the solid line is for comprehension, and the dotted line that you'll see in a second is for production. So what you see here is that children from the first phase, so that is P2 and P3, they comprehended approximately 70% of nouns, the nouns that we gave them in those tasks, and their comprehension increased to around 80% in P3. What happened in the second phase when we tested them, not the same children, I should say, right? When we tested other children in 2021, so last spring. Surprisingly, the results were also quite similar. So what we found was that the children, now the phase 2 is in orange, from P2 to P3, they moved from 70% to around 80% in comprehension, but then there was a kind of plateau, and then by P5, there is a bit of an improvement again. What happens with the multilingual children? So the multilingual children, we actually managed to get only children from P3 and P5. But surprisingly, and the sample is small, but surprisingly, they did very similarly to what the bilingual children did from both phases. What about their production? Production was lower. We expected this. We expected the children to be able to produce fewer words, than they were able to comprehend. So they were able to produce, they had accuracy of 30% on the production of nouns, and that improved in P3 in the first phase. What about the second phase? What we found in the second phase was, again, there was an improvement, but again, it was a plateau from P3 to P5. How about the multilingual children? The multilingual children did a bit worse in this case in terms of production of nouns. How about verbs? Very similar patterns in a sense, but a bit lower accuracy in verbs. So in phase 1, there was accuracy between 60 and 70% in comprehension. Very similar pattern in the second phase, and some more increase in P5. Multilingual children are actually within the range of the bilingual children. How about production? Lower again production for verbs. Again, we were expecting this because nouns are meant to be easier to acquire than verbs. So there is an improvement from P2 to P3, from like 25% accuracy to almost 40% accuracy. Very similar pattern in the second phase, but we see that also there is continued improvement even in P5. And the multilingual kids seem to be, are doing also very well. How about their English? So again, the same kind of way of demonstrating the results. So for nouns, we see that there we actually see really ceiling performance. So we were expecting this because these children were coming from English-speaking homes. So we were expecting them to be doing very well in English, even though English is not taught in school. So you see 95% accuracy, same pattern in the second phase. And surprisingly, also even the multilingual kids who speak so many languages in the home, so there's lots of competition for using different languages in the home, they didn't seem to have any problem comprehending the vocabulary that we gave them. And surprisingly for English also, now you kind of can see the dotted line because they're doing so well in production that you cannot really differentiate production from comprehension when it comes to English in any of the phases and in any of the groups. And the same pattern was also observed for verbs, very high accuracy across both phases in comprehension, same pattern in multilingual kids, so the purple dots. And the only difference that we found was in the case of verbs, where basically we saw that they were doing a bit worse in producing verbs in English compared to comprehending verbs in English. So what do they produce if they don't produce the target word in Gaelic? They would give us many times the word in English. So for example, instead of giving us the word in Gaelic, I'm not going to try to pronounce it, they would say wave instead of the Gaelic word. And this happened a lot, especially at the very beginning of schooling, so in P2 and P3. What else did they do? They gave us definitions. So they would say saying hello instead of greeting or waving. They would say bird instead of giving us the word for duck. Again, the equivalent English words, so Gaelic words. They would say watch instead of clock. And they did something very interesting also that we call blending. So basically they would give us the root in English. So for waving, as you can see, this is the Gaelic word, but instead of giving us the Gaelic word, they would say wav, and they would just add the ending in Gaelic. So it would say something like a wavash, which of course is not a Gaelic verb. Yeah, so there was this mixing that Antonella kind of mentioned that people do with languages. So just to summarize very briefly, bilingual and multilingual children in Gaelic medium education, they achieved very high scores on English vocabulary. I didn't show you any grammar results. They were almost a ceiling, and this performance was higher than in Gaelic. The children comprehended more words than they were able to produce. So we found that accuracy and comprehension was better than in production. And we also found that this gap was more prominent in Gaelic. We also found that the gap between comprehension and production kind of closed from P2 to P5, but it closed more for verbs than for nouns, and still they weren't ceiling. So we cannot say that they're, oh, sorry, something is updating in the background, which I don't like. And also, they didn't, the bilingual and the multilingual children in GME didn't seem to differ from each other, at least on the measures that we used. Of course, there are various caveats here. First, the sample that we had was very small, the sample of multilingual children. But interestingly, the multilingual children came from homes that, you know, where a language was spoken that is not similar to Gaelic. So usually when we see some like good performance in a language in multilingual context, we're trying to think whether there is some, the person speaks another language that can boost their performance in this other language. But for Gaelic, that wasn't the case. So it wasn't the case that any of these other kids were like speaking another Celtic language in the home. So maybe what we're seeing is like just the ability of being multilingual is boosts your ability to learn languages. So we're trying to kind of now understand the results. So what we can say for sure is that exposure to English in the community seems to offset any effects of lack of school instruction. And that's the case for both bilingual and multilingual children. Of course, this also may be related to the kind of task that we used and the words that we looked at. Maybe they were too easy for this level, but they were easy for English, but not for Gaelic, right? Also, speaking different languages in the home does not seem to compromise children's ability to learn Gaelic at school. And that's particularly interesting in the case of multilingual children. I should say this is a population that has not been looked at before. So next steps that we want to take is we want to understand better the kind of nature of exposure of these children, both the bilingual children and the multilingual children. So for the bilingual children, we've already analyzed the results and we're writing them up for publication. But we want to look at exactly how exposure works in multilingual homes. We want to understand how children with early exposure to Gaelic, especially the ones who attended nursery, differed, if at all, from the children who did not attend a nursery, and we went straight to Gaelic medium primary schools. And we want to know more about any similarities and differences between the bilingual children and the multilingual children in our sample, and what drives differences or similarities. So, oops. Okay, that's it for me for today. I have to thank all my collaborators and research assistants who managed to collect all the data, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have in the end. Oh.
Tapalat gomór, Vicky, sin fatan na chomain agus bhaisiid uhasoch in noch agus am cíndach go bí ceisneach ag tíneach an dearag. Thank you very much, Vicky, for another stimulating and very interesting presentation, and I'm sure there'll be questions at the end. Now, people will notice that my appearance has changed slightly. I understand that for some listeners, I may have been cutting out a little bit. I'm not sure whether it's an internet issue at my end or something else, but I've decided to put on the headphones. Christy, if you'd let me know whether this is an improvement, that will be great. We will carry on. The last presentations will be from my colleague Wilson McLeod and myself. If you'll bear with me for just a second, I'll take you through the first part of the presentation, and then I'll get Wilson to join me for the end. So we are now changing tack slightly, moving to language policy issues and broadly sociolinguistic issues. Our focus is on the Manifesto commitments of the Scottish National Party made as part of their manifesto for the most recent Scottish parliamentary elections. And as everybody knows, I'm sure, the SNP formed won the largest number of constituencies and came very close to a majority. They are now in government with the Scottish Greens, and so we can hope that they will bring their policy commitments in a range of areas to fruition, in particular in relation to Gaelic. We can hopefully expect that, I should say. So I thought we would take a look at a couple of their commitments in general. There were a number of commitments in the manifesto, however. They were somewhat surprising in that some of them were very detailed. There was, for example, a very specific set of references to the Gaelic medium secondary school in Edinburgh that is on the council's agenda. They also included some interesting, other interesting commitments with regard to Gaelic medium education. They said that there would be a general presumption against co-locating Gaelic medium and English medium schools. That seemed to be a clear signal that they would prefer a standalone school rather than the sort of shared campus that indeed has been mooted in Edinburgh. They wanted to encourage the creation of new primary and secondary schools, that's standalone schools, not simply units. And of course, commitment to invest and increase to increase the number of Gaelic medium teachers at both primary and secondary level. But the two that we're going to focus on are, first of all, the commitment that they would explore the creation of a recognized Gaeltach to raise the level of language competence and the provision of more services through the medium of Gaelic, and to extend opportunities to use Gaelic in everyday situations and formal settings. This makes it possible for the Gaelic language to be used more often in the home and the community. And the other commitment that we'll talk about is that they committed to bringing forward a new Scottish Languages Bill, which takes further support for Gaelic, but also acts on the Scots language and recognizes that Scotland is a multilingual society. So with regard to this first commitment that I'd like to take a look at, this question of a recognized Gaeltach, first of all, as part of the context, the term is well known in policy terms in Ireland, but not so in Scotland, when we refer to Gaeltacht in Gaelic, often the reference is to a geographical area that sort of corresponds with the physical highlands. A couple of centuries ago, into the 19th century, the physical highlands more or less coincided with the speech area. But of course, particularly over the course of the 20th century, most of the mainland highlands, Gaelic is only vestigially and weakly present. The language is now more concentrated in the inner and outer Hebrides and certain communities on the west coast. And we see this from census data. In the most recent census from 2011, 52% of the population of the Western Isles spoke Gaelic, and over 80% in some rural districts. Skye and Tiree also contained quite dense concentrations of Gaelic speakers. But the highest level on any mainland parish was Ardnamurchan, that recorded 19.3% Gaelic speakers. In most areas, the Highlands, the percentage is much, much lower than that. But it's also important to recognize that almost half of all Gaelic speakers now live in the lowlands, and that there are significant concentrations in places like Glasgow, where there are about 10,000 speakers. However, in those areas, even in Glasgow, the proportion of Gaelic speakers is very low, 1% or below. Finally, relevant to a couple of things that we're going to talk about in the next couple of minutes. In 2011, only about a quarter of Gaelic speakers lived in parishes where at least 50% of the population could speak Gaelic. And 43%, again, close to half, lived in parishes where only about 1.1% of the population could speak Gaelic. So these are the contexts for any discussion. And on this slide, and we're happy to circulate the slides to anybody that would like them as well, it's just a pictorial representation of what I was saying, where we see in the Western Isles, marked in red, the highest concentrations of Gaelic speakers. The areas in pink, essentially the inner Hebridean islands, as well as parts of Western Ross, Kintail, and so forth. Those are between 15 and 50% Gaelic speaking, and then lower percentages in the bulk of the mainland highlands, and of course in the rest of Scotland. Recognized Gaeltacht. Just some basic issues that are not clear. First of all, where would this concept of a Gaeltacht be recognized? Would it be recognized, for example, in statute, in particular in the new Scottish Languages Bill that Wilson will talk about in a moment, or would it be recognized in other policy documents? It's not clear from the Manifesto commitment. The even more important point is which areas would be included. Again, when we talk about the Gaeltacht, if you drive up the A9, you get past Pitlochry, a little further north from there. You come across a great big sign that welcomes you to the Gaeltacht. But as we've seen, there are very few Gaelic speakers in those areas. So would the areas be determined based on numbers of speakers in a council area or some other existing administrative territory, or smaller geographical units such as the civil parishes that are used for census purposes, and what number or percentage of the population would trigger qualification to be part of a Gaeltacht. We should also bear in mind the Irish experience. As I mentioned, the concept of a Gaeltacht goes back to the 1920s, and people in Ireland are very familiar with the concept of what the Gaeltacht is, or at least is supposed to be. But even in Ireland, that conception is changing somewhat, thanks to the Gaeltacht Act of 2012, which created both Gaeltacht language planning areas that are roughly contiguous with the Gaeltacht has been determined statutorily and in practice over a large number of years. But they also introduced this concept of Gaeltacht service towns, areas that are outside of the formal Gaeltacht, but which serve Gaeltacht areas. And finally, this interesting concept of Irish language networks, which is recognition of the fact that Irish is now used and is used on a practical day-to-day basis in many parts of the country, and that there are many sorts of networks of speakers. So the concept in Ireland is changing. And the final point is that there is an implicit policy which arguably already exists with regard to a Gaeltacht in the sense of a Gaelic-speaking area and the implications for policy. For example, in Bord na Gaelic's statutory guidance on the preparation of Gaelic language plans, which all public authorities are supposed to follow, we have this. It essentially created 4 different types of areas with the expectations about the level of service commitment being much greater in areas where there are higher percentages of people. And in the first of these 4 areas, which applied in areas where the local population was comprised of greater than 50% Gaelic speakers, where in those areas where those who understand, speak, read, or write Gaelic form a majority of the population, the expectation is that the public authority will work towards, within a reasonable timescale and having regard to its particular circumstances, creating the conditions in which Gaelic can be used across all of its services to the public, and in which any employee who wants to use Gaelic in the execution of their duties can do so. This is a very ambitious goal of essentially full bilingualism. It was recognized that even in the case of the Western Isles, it would likely not be possible in 2007 for the Western Isles Council, Corlin and Yellan Sheet, to deliver full bilingualism in its first or even second plan, but they should be working towards it. So we already have the kernel of a policy here, arguably. Some of the options may be to give further policy recognition to this, either in statute or in some other strategic document of government, and presumably of Bord na Gaelic. But this 50% threshold may now be too high. In the next census, it's an open question of whether even in the Western Isles, a majority will still be Gaelic speaking. And the board, I think in its second national plan, already began to recognize that the threshold should be somewhat lower for this highest level of obligation. And would the principles set out in the guidance be given greater specificity and perhaps set out on a put on a statutory footing in any new legislation? These are options that aren't clear at this point, but should be considered. So at that point, I will turn things over to my colleague, Wilson MacLeod, who will talk a bit more about the second aspect of the SNP commitments, the proposed a Scottish Languages Bill. Wilson.
Morning, thank Rob. I guess hello, dunya. Oh, Irash can Rob Guru Alasha. Rob Irash can slide on
My screen seems to have locked, I'm afraid. Oh, there we are.
Sure. Okay. No.
There we are.
No, Kumar. Right, okay. Hello, everyone. So yes, to continue from what Rob was saying and pick up this commitment in the manifesto to a new Scottish Languages Bill. This, to some extent, came out of nowhere. There wasn't a lot of policy discussion leading up to this, and indeed about the commitment. There wasn't, there's not really any more flesh on the bones there. And as you can see, it's phrased very vaguely: further steps to support Gaelic acts on the Scots language and recognises that Scotland is a multilingual society. So just a few observations about this. First of all, that it's not necessarily the case that you can group different languages with different needs in a single piece of legislation, particularly when different languages are at very different stages of development. So Gaelic has a reasonably solid development infrastructure, the number of organizations, strategies, and so on and so forth, and provision in a number of fields. It doesn't compare very favorably with some other languages we could look at, such as Welsh or indeed Basque, but nevertheless, there's an infrastructure there. If we look at other languages, there's far less existing, and therefore you're mixing very different kinds of things. So that's problematic to think that it would be straightforward to deal with everything on a one-size-fits-all basis. We have a precedent for this. Those of you who've been following Scottish language policy for some time, there was a commitment in 2003 to develop a national languages strategy. This finally emerged just a few weeks before the Scottish Parliament election in 2007, meant to be a comprehensive strategy. It was a very brief document, and frankly, it was quite a damp squib. It was disappeared after the election and so on and so forth. So not really a very successful model to try to deal with things comprehensively. In Northern Ireland at the moment, well, for quite some time actually, there's been a push for legislation for Irish. And one of the very clear demands there from Irish language activists is that they want a freestanding Irish Language Act, that it wouldn't be wise to have a more general Languages Act to look at Ulster Scots and so on, because there are specific needs and issues that need to be dealt with in relation to Irish. So if we look at Scots and other languages in Scotland, often described as community languages, which would be most obviously languages such as Urdu, Punjabi, Cantonese, Polish, and so on, but many others conceivably. We see that there's very limited provision in many respects. It varies, of course, from language to language. Most obviously, very little in the education system in terms of formal structures. And legislation is a very high-level policy instrument. It's extremely high in the level of policy structures. We really call it a macro-level policy, very inflexible. To deliver things on the ground, you need something much more specific, much more micro-level provision. And arguably, there's much more of an urgent need in terms of recognizing that Scotland is a multilingual society to make that operative in things like the 1+2 teaching program in schools, to make sure that a wider range of languages are actually taught in Scottish schools and so on and so forth. So it's not obvious to me that language legislation is a priority for all languages. There are other ways to give recognition to the multilingual reality in Scotland. I'd certainly welcome that, but there are issues with doing it by language. Actually, language legislation. I'll just mention in passing the British Sign Language Scotland Act of 2015, a very important piece of legislation, but really at an early stage of implementation, and quite hard to see where that is going yet. Next slide, please. Rob? Can you tap it out? So thinking specifically about the Gaelic side of it, possible legislative reforms for Gaelic, what sorts of things might we look at? Well, very briefly, the existing legislation has been in place for about 16 years, the Gaelic Act of 2005. And that briefly did several things. It created a formal national language planning agency, Poileasaidh Gaelic, language development body. It requires the preparation of a national Gaelic language plan every 5 years, an overarching national strategy. And it requires individual public bodies to prepare Gaelic language plans if they're asked to do by Poileasaidh Gaelic. And there's about 60 of these language plans in effect now. That's including almost all of the local authorities and many other public bodies in Scotland, including the University of Edinburgh. One possibility that's been sketched out is a model we see in other countries, and it's been successful in different ways to different degrees, is the creation of a language commissioner. with real enforcement powers to drive forward implementation of legislation and more generally championing the language in public life. Originally a model from Canada, but implemented in different ways in Ireland and Wales in recent years. Could that be a useful way forward in Scotland? Potentially. One issue perhaps is that a commissioner needs to have something to commission. There needs to be a clear set of rights and obligations in relation to language. If that really isn't defined sufficiently, then there isn't clarity in terms of the role and especially the power of the commissioner. So that would be something that needs to be thought about very hard. Another thing that's being done elsewhere in Wales and now contemplated in Ireland is moving away from this idea of a patchwork of individual language plans from different bodies and rather having language standards that apply in different areas, so that, for example, every health board would be expected to make a certain level of provision for Gaelic and so on. And as I say, that's been done in Wales and elsewhere. Difficult in Scotland in some respects because for a couple of reasons. Number one, the fact that there's a very low level of current service provision. The reality is that even though we have Gaelic language plans, many of them are really quite minimal in terms of the expectations and so on. And very much in Scotland, we have, as you saw from the map, real variation in Scotland according to where Gaelic is spoken, how many Gaelic speakers there are, their density in the population. The idea of the Act was that there would be a sliding scale, that there would be variation according to different parts of the country, different communities. So at the top of the scale, as Rob showed you, the idea that there would be an expectation of full bilingualism in more strongly Gaelic areas, but the converse of that in areas where there's little Gaelic spoken, that the expectations would be much, much lower. Possibly, as Rob sketched out, the idea of putting in this guidance in the legislation as a mechanism for strengthening Gaelic language plans. However, I think that there's a question of turning around a culture, that we've got 15 years, if you like, of relatively weak plans and expectation among public sector organizations that this kind of legislation is not going to bring about fundamental changes. So that might be hard to achieve in practical terms, in terms of moving forward. And then finally, just some more general concerns about legislation as a policy instrument and strategically. First is the sort of opportunity costs, the energy that you need to spend on developing proposals for language legislation and then negotiating their way through the legislative process. This is a very complex and time-consuming process. We see that it took 10 years to get the Gaelic Language Act put through Parliament here. Cumann na Gaelic, the lead organization at the time, spent a huge amount of effort doing that. In Wales, really since about 2006 or so, there's been a constant process of considering and revising or discussing legislative change. In Ireland, it's been going for about 10 years with reform to the legislation there. So it's a very significant commitment to take on. And it does detract from other possibilities. More generally in Gaelic, for a number of years, there's been a perception among many concerned with Gaelic development and so on, that there's been too much emphasis on formal structures, top-down approaches, as opposed to more grassroots and community level development. So a further push towards the very high level legislative agenda might not be the most popular, might not be the most appropriate kind of direction for Gaelic language policy at this juncture. And generally speaking, successful language policy requires interventions at different levels. Language legislation is very important to provide an authoritative framework for policy, but it has to be connected to effective interventions at lower levels, meso and micro level interventions. And it is eminently possible to get the balance wrong, to have too much emphasis on the formal strategies and the high level maybe top-down approaches and not enough about the community and grassroots approaches. So those are some of the challenges that that arise out of this issue that we're presented with. So, Sinead, Tapalet.
Tapalet Wilson, agus amadúlich gun de jaar mi ye an tashbenig misro jeshar mar a chuniku becken rippelchenakam lesh computer. Thank you very much, Wilson. And that brings us to the end of our formal presentations.